When it comes to connecting, there is no substitute for undersea cables. Thousands of satellites may orbit the Earth, but more than 99% of global internet traffic still flows through fiber optic cables laying on the ocean floor. A single high-capacity cable installed today can transmit half a petabit, over 1 million home high-speed internet connections.
Private networks for the largest of the companies rely upon subsea cables for their logistical planning, their transport, their just-in-time deliveries. Logistics, finance, health, education, science, technology, sharing, it all goes over subsea cables, the loss of which would mean life as we know it would be gone.
If you think about that, you will start to understand how incredibly important undersea cables are, both in terms of our connectivity, our ability to communicate across the world, our ability to run digital technology, but also essentially the national security risk.
Some 1.3 million kilometers of those cables snake across the world's ocean floor. Eduardo Mateo is head of strategy for NEC's submarine division.
The basic anatomy of subsea cables are very long-distance pipes that have optical fibers inside, certain amount of optical fibers, and every certain amount of kilometers, 90, 100 kilometers, these signals that travel along the fibers need to be re-energized, amplified, energized from the sea, from the landing stations. So it's a very unique network. That amplifier that sits in the middle of the ocean receives power from thousands of kilometers away.
As important as undersea cables are to all global communications, most of us don't hear about them until there's an interruption, which happens about 200 times a year, sometimes because of wear and tear, but sometimes in suspicious circumstances. That's why experts like NJFX CEO Gil Santalese and Norwegian infrastructure builder Petter Narbo have a system to reroute traffic and keep the data moving.
So when we get to shallow water, we bury it underneath the seabed to protect the cable so it's not hit by some trawler vessel or an anchor by chance. But you can wonder, like in northern parts of Norway, in Svalbard, we had an incident like 2.5 years ago where one vessel had traveled across the cable 130 times. And then it was able to ram the cable and make a power outage on the cables. And you can question whether that was intentional or not, but it was a Russian vessel. If there's an outage, that's why we come to places like the New Jersey Fiber Exchange that interconnects with 6 or 7 of these different subsea cables.
So our facility is prepared to support subsea cables, and these cables need redundancy on land as well. It's no longer possible to have a single point of failure. We've got 26 terrestrial cables that leave NJFX in 4 directions, aerial, underground, which allow diversity for these subsea cables. Now they have options. Something happens on land, whether it's a highway or railroad, we can redivert that traffic in a different path.
The first undersea cable was laid in the 1850s, stretching from Ireland to Newfoundland, with Queen Victoria christening it by sending a telegram to President Buchanan. In the 20th century, telegrams gave way to telephone calls. And then the U.S. deregulated the telephone companies just as the internet arrived on the scene, opening up the market to new players and fueling a boom in competitive investment in submarine cables.
We have always been focused on being the best in the world at moving optical bits.
Gary Smith runs Sienna, whose technology powers the modern global internet, providing the networking systems and software that increase each cable's capacity even as more and more are installed.
Basically, down each end of a piece of fiber, you put different colors of light and pull them out at the ends into, virtual fibers. And the first technology we had in this space, we think we can make, 4 fibers out of this single fiber. And they said, that's fantastic. We don't think we'll ever need 4. By the time we got to deploy it, it was 8. And they said, we're never going to use 8 fibers. And now we're putting literally, thousands of virtual fibers down a single fiber.
In the boom years of the 1990s and early 2000s, building transoceanic cables seemed like a great business to be in.
It was like, where do we build the next one? How do we leverage the debt and equity markets to get the capital? And then let's deploy it very, very quickly.
Mike Constable was at Global Crossing during that time, a company that pre-sold capacity to telecom carriers before cables even hit the water. But then the music stopped.
And at that stage, all the speculation about how much data the world was going to need was not being accurately analysed and forecast. So suddenly the debt levels were super high and they couldn't pay off that debt. So ultimately there was a collapse. Investment pretty much stopped. Around 2002, investment in subsea cables effectively stopped. And it took a long time to see investment come back.
Everybody built so much capacity with this kind of technology because all of a sudden we could scale up the fibers. The challenge was no one knew what to do with that capacity, right? And no one would pay for it.
For years, nothing new was built. But the 21st century brought new demands, this time for financial transactions measured not in milliseconds, but in microseconds. Michael Lewis captured it in Flash Boys, a world where speed meant profit. Joe Hilt, now with Anova Financial Networks, led the commercial team behind a bold new cable called the Hibernia Express.
You were particularly involved, as you say, in the financial part of the business, and obviously people really want to be able to trade fast.
Yeah, and I think we saw there was a cable system that was built between New Jersey and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange that was built as a straight line, right? And we said, wow, we're a cable system provider in the Atlantic. Somebody must need between the two financial pillars of the world, in New York and London. 2011, we'd begun signing clients that would become financial customers on the system. And when we did that, we started to do subsea surveys.
Wall Street helped finance it, alongside Chinese partner Huawei. But that set off alarm bells in Washington, and as the pressure mounted, the message was clear. The project wouldn't get approved if it relied on Chinese technology.
We originally had started out with Huawei Global Marine. We had decided to move away from Huawei Global Marine about mid-project, right? And most of that was based on the United States and feelings towards companies like Huawei and H3C at that time.
Huawei was out, along with its technology, and in came TE Subcom and Sienna.
So we did need to make a change in our equipment, and we chose to have a bigger relationship with Sienna. You know, so much like we laid the cable systems with TE Subcom, we decided to make Sienna at that point in time our de facto standard for wavelength services.
Frankly, the whole Huawei piece was really a wake-up call for the West, you know, in general, around the criticality of this infrastructure. By deploying this infrastructure, letting someone, you know, else have that infrastructure was a real challenge.
Unlike others, Sienna hadn't partnered with Chinese firms. For years, that was seen as a mistake, until it wasn't.
And we decided really to be sort of in some ways the sort of our main competitor around the world was Huawei. So we decided to be, you know, the antithesis of that. We had no manufacturing in China. We were very unusual in that regard, but that was a strategic decision on our part. You know, you look at the marketplace now and you see a very bifurcated market between those that utilize Huawei and those that don't want to, which is really a proxy for geopolitical divide that you're seeing in the world. Governments are very conscious of it now. It's not just left to normal commercial decision making, for sure.
Mike Constable was tapped to lead Huawei Marine as the Chinese giant sought to push past U.S. resistance. But as geopolitical tensions continued to rise, the U.S. stood firm.
So that was really quite damaging at that time. Slowly, our access to, or our invitations to bid on a number of projects started to dry up. We, Huawei Marine, weren't able to build cables into the US. We were not able to build cables into Europe and to other nations such as Australia. In fact, at the time, we had won a contract to build a cable from the Solomon Islands to Australia, and that was subsequently terminated.
The U.S. intervened in several planned trans-Pacific cables, including the Pacific Light Cable Network linking Hong Kong and California. According to Jennifer Bacchus, acting head of the State Department's Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, it came down to one word: trust.
What started to become apparent to us is that we do not see the world in the same way that China sees the world. And that ultimately, while we view this as a positive way to work together, to bring people together, I think the Chinese view it as a way to control, surveil, and steal. And so as a result, I think it's been a gradual realization that we don't have the same worldview, we don't share the same values.
Pacific Light Cable was one that was going to go to Hong Kong, got shut down. Is that why you decide not to allow them to have a land station in Hong Kong?
So on the Pacific Light Cable, yes, what it would do is if it landed in Hong Kong, the Chinese government could very easily access that landing station and both take any information they wanted to, exfiltrate it, steal it, call it what you want. They also could potentially use that access to interrupt the data flows, to reroute the data flows. There's no way to tear apart espionage from intellectual property theft, from essentially having the dagger poised at your neck that you're going to cut off somebody's communications network.
Is there a cost here in protecting some of the data that you suggest to potentially U.S. businesses competing with their Chinese counterparts in third parts of the world?
What we have found in going around the world is that there's enthusiasm for trusted connectivity, especially when you're talking about subsea cables. And when you talk about how do you attract investment into a country, whether you are a small island state or a large country, they want advanced Western technology, they want AI, they want data centers, they want hyperscale cloud. If you look at sort of the share of the market that HMN Tech, which is the Huawei company, has had worldwide, where they were 5 years ago versus where they are today, they're on a downward trajectory. As countries, economies, and people embrace the idea that they want to have sovereignty and control over their information and over their future success and prosperity.
Google invested in a single fiber pair, which we thought initially was going to be enough capacity. But the one thing Google and all of the hyperscalers always get wrong is forecasting and demand models. Demand has always outstripped actual need. So shortly after completing Unity, we started on a second transpac cable called Faster, because that's what we kept getting told. Build it faster. We need it now.
Jayne Stowell was the first employee for Google's subsea unit when the hyperscaler moved into the business, connecting their data centers around the globe.
There was definitely a rising need with Google driving that need. So I had never done Latin American cables before, so I turned my attention there and put together a consortium to build from the US to Brazil, and then a second mini consortium to build from Brazil to Uruguay, and then onward to Argentina. One of the important things to understand about putting together consortium is sometimes it can take as long to build a consortium as it does to build a cable. If you build it yourself, you can move much faster. There are three primary reasons. One is cost, the second is speed to market, and the third is network architecture technology. Google wanted to control all three elements.
You said that historically it's been very difficult to predict demand, that often people are wrong about demand. What is the risk today that there's overbuilding going on?
I think relatively low, because we had been building cables for the internet and for the cloud, for cloud computing. The next advent is AI. This is not just about cables. This is about cables that are connecting the lifeblood of data centers. And for artificial intelligence, you need to build the artificial intelligence models first before you can have the inference for anything that's useful for you and me. So building those models requires mass mass amounts of data transport to key data centers that are modern, energy efficient, plenitude of energy, and nearby access to subsea cables. So you will see a whole new model of data centers moving outside of city centers to locations with large amounts of reliable power and ready access to big fat pipes of subsea cables.
One such fat pipe is the Hafru cable connecting New Jersey to Norway's low-cost renewable energy. Petter Narbo, executive chairman of Bulk Infrastructure, partnered with Google and Meta on the project.
Norway has about 100% of renewable energy. And we have a surplus of it because we have 100 years of history of building hydropower plants from high altitude lakes that runs in cracks in the river into the ocean, where we harvest the energy several times. So that's why Norway is such a good place for large compute and the new power-hungry industry that we see today.
For hyperscalers like Google and Meta, building and owning subsea cables became much more than simply a cost of doing business. It was the backbone of their growth, and they decided they couldn't rely on others. They had to invest and build for themselves and work directly with firms like Subcom for the cable and gear and Sienna to provide the optical technology.
The entry point for us was actually aligned around the cloud players coming into that space, because all of a sudden you needed very high speed performance and capacity, step function more than you'd seen in the past. And so the timing of that, was such that these cloud players really wanted a very high performance, submarine cables. Their ambitions are, into all of, most of the countries around the world, and without that submarine cable capacity, and no one was going to build it for them.
Given the demand, why is it that others didn't step in to build what the hyperscalers needed? Projesh Banerjee is Infrastructure Managing Director at KKR and says that the economics are quite different for subsea cables than for other private equity investments.
What has happened historically is that though data demand has gone up exponentially, the price of data has come down substantially over time. So if you owned the cable itself and you owned the fibers, you would have effectively a depreciating asset from a pricing power perspective. Data centers are quite different because data centers, again, yes, you're in a specific availability zone or connected into network architecture, but the value of that land should be appreciating over time, right? The value, you're not selling bandwidth and connectivity. You're selling power and real estate, very strategic real estate, within a certain availability zone or network architecture.
So if it's the hyperscalers who are destined to be the dominant investors in the undersea cables themselves, what does that leave for other investors?
Where we do see private equity and digital infrastructure funds coming into the market is in the services or the support companies that support the market. So the digital infrastructure funds and the private equity players aren't investing in greenfield networks or building cable systems themselves. They are very focused on, broadly speaking, on the service industry that supports this critical infrastructure.
KKR sees opportunity in the services surrounding undersea cables, providing critical functions that hyperscalers need but prefer not to manage themselves.
Subsea cables are to data centers what railway tracks are to railway stations. You can't just upgrade the stations and the terminals and have those tracks lying completely unrepaired and having them break down, as traffic goes up. You've got to invest in both parts of the ecosystem to ensure that you have uninterrupted service, especially today when the cost of the downtime, right, for the OTTs, for the hyperscalers, for the e-commerce players, the cost of network interruption has gone up meaningfully. So it's mission-critical infrastructure services provided through asset-heavy companies, but not exposed to the actual volume and the price of that data that goes through that fiber system.
As an industry, we have a global fleet of around 60 ships, and around 30% of that fleet is going to reach its end of use by date within the next decade. So while we are putting tens of billions of dollars of investment into new cable systems, as an industry, we're not putting the same sort of capital to help maintain these systems.
Nobody wants to build a navy, right, to service their own subsea needs, because that's also inefficient. You need independent service providers who can use those same vessels to service other people. So let us build the cable ships and service all the hyperscalers and the telcos. Let them focus on their core competence, their revenue drivers, exactly what they want to be using their capital budget allowances towards, and let us take on the burden of managing the subsea needs.
First came deregulation and the internet boom, and a rush to lay undersea cables. Then came the bust, when overbuilding and deal-making got ahead of business fundamentals. Now we're in the middle of a new boom, powered by hyperscalers and the rise of AI data centers. So what's next? Smith says Sienna is busier than ever, and they are just getting started.
We're still at the very early days of this. If people are going to monetize all this investment that they're making in GPUs and AI, it's got to come out onto the network. It's got to come out of the data centers. I think as an ecosystem, as an industry, we're grossly underestimating how much capacity will be required.
Is there a great investment opportunity? The demand drivers say there are, but really it is who is going to move into this space, because it is dominated by the people who are moving the most data around the world. From the cable industry perspective, we're not quite sure exactly what the development of AI is going to do to the deployment of cables. I think, it's obviously going to require a lot more cable deployments. Just how much, we're not sure.